So today, welcome to the University of Reading, Professor Elizabeth Loftus, someone who has done more than any other psychologist to document the unreliability of human memory. Elizabeth grew up in California, receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree in Mathematics and Psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1966. She then went on to Stanford University to study for an MA and PhD, initially working on a topic around semantic memory. However, when her cousin was less than impressed by Elizabeth's discovery that people are faster at naming a bird that is yellow than a yellow bird, Elizabeth decided that she actually wanted to work on something that was just a little bit more practical. So this led to a move to the University of Washington, where one of the first studies she conducted is the now classic Loftus and Palmer 1974 study, which has the wonderful title, The Reconstruction of Automobile Destruction. Now this study, which we're going to hear more about from Elizabeth herself in a moment, as you all know, is a key fixture of GCSE and A-level psychology textbooks, as well as university cognitive psychology lectures across the world. The influence of her work extends well beyond the laboratory and into the real world. She's now advised on more than 250 legal cases on eyewitness testimony, and her 2013 TED Global Talk has been watched by more than 3.5 million people worldwide. Elizabeth's career is an astonishing story that spans over 4 decades. She is simply one of the most influential psychologists of all time. And today is your chance to put your questions to her. So just to explain the format, we've asked Elizabeth just to begin by telling us a little bit about that classic Loftus and Palmer study. What we'll then do is that Chloe and I will join Elizabeth on stage, and then we'll open up the floor to questions, primarily on the Loftus and Palmer study to begin with, and then we'll invite after that some wider questions about Elizabeth's life and her career from the audience. Chloe will also then ask some additional questions which have been sent in by audience members in advance of this event. And as you ask your questions, just a plea right at the beginning, try and keep your questions as succinct and clear as you possibly can, and that will allow us to get through as many questions as we can in the next hour or so. So, without further ado, please welcome onto the stage Professor Elizabeth.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure for me to be here to have a chance to tell you just a little bit about that really old study that some of you know about. And just as you heard in the introduction, I was studying semantic memory. I was kind of theoretical issues having to do with memory. I did have a conversation with a cousin who was a lawyer, and when I told her I was an experimental psychologist, she said, well, then you must have made some discoveries. I said, I have. I discovered that people are faster to give you the name of a bird that's yellow than to give you the name of a yellow bird, about 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second faster. My cousin just sort of looked at me and said something like, and how much did we pay for that result? Meaning the funding of scientific work. So it was really at the time of that conversation that I thought, I just want to do something that has a little bit more practical relevance. I knew something about memory. I had a long-standing interest in legal issues and legal questions. So maybe I could combine that knowledge and education I had with a long-standing interest, and I decided that I would study eyewitness testimony. But there's so many things you can study about eyewitness testimony, so what part of the domain would I look at? And I decided, why don't I look at the questioning process? Because when witnesses see something like a crime or an accident, invariably they are asked questions about their experience. And so there I was at the University of Washington. John Palmer was an undergraduate honors student. he wanted to do some research with me, and so I suggested that he work on this project where we were going to be questioning people about accidents that they had seen. Now, why accidents? Simple. I had a former professor from my graduate school days who'd gone to the U.S. Department of Transportation to be a director in the Department of Transportation, and he told me, if you'll study accidents, we've got some research money to give out for that. And so I thought, okay, accidents, but that is how come it was accidents. And so what John Palmer and I did was to borrow films from driver training schools and police departments that showed accidents, and we would then question people about their experiences using different verbs with different eyewitnesses. So some people are asked how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other, others how fast were they going when they hit each other, how fast were they going when they smashed into each other. And we showed, as you can see here, that the people claimed that the cars were going faster if we use the verb smashed than, for example, hit or contacted. And so we had shown then that the way you word a question, and even just changing a single word or two in your question, is enough to influence how people gave an answer. But then Palmer and I went a little further and we said, well, maybe these questions have a long-range effect. Maybe those early questions could also influence the answers to other questions that you put to a witness even much later. And so we did the second experiment where we just asked some subjects the smash question, asked other subjects the hit question. We had a control group that wasn't questioned about the speed at all. And now we want you to come back a week later. We have a few more questions for you about that accident. And the one we cared about was, did you see any broken glass? And you can see here that our subjects there was no broken glass, but our subjects were far more likely to claim that they saw this non-existent broken glass if you questioned them with the verb smashed than when the same question was asked with the verb hit. And that percentage, 14% claiming they saw non-existent glass with the hit question, was comparable to the rate of claiming non-existent glass for those controls. And so we then concluded that those early questions can affect the answer to later questions, but in fact, what we really began to think about was the idea that what these early questions are doing, they're supplying information, sometimes misinformation, that can later on affect what people remember. It's just one form of misinformation that can be supplied to people after an event is over that can contaminate, transform, or change their memory in some way. Later, we would go on to do other studies, such as the one where we showed people an accident where a car goes through a yield sign at the intersection. And again, by asking a single leading question that mentions the stop sign, here's that question. It was something like, did another car pass the red dots and while it was stopped at the stop sign? We got lots of people to believe and remember that they saw a stop sign at the intersection, not a yield sign. And so even if you show people the two scenes side by side and say, which is the one you originally saw, after misinformation, many people will choose the sign that corresponds to the misinformation, even though the truth is staring them in the face. They don't choose it anymore. And so we now refer to this phenomenon in the literature as the misinformation effect. When you expose people to misinformation, whether it's through leading questions or overhearing another witness, or being engaged in an interrogation that is somehow misleading. All of these provide an opportunity for a witness to be exposed to misinformation that can contaminate or transform the memory. So that is a little bit about kind of how we got into this study and how we began to think about it in the few years after we published it. And I'll stop with that.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely fascinating. I think before we move on to the audience, I think Chloe's just going to open the question.
So it is very unusual for me to be here today to be able to ask you these questions, because I think, like quite a lot of people who are here today, I've studied these studies at A-level, so it is quite a famous study. So when did you realise that you were really onto something quite exciting with this study?
Well, first of all, when I saw the effects on the estimates of speed, and I began to, I was already getting involved in the idea of applying the scientific work to legal cases. And I thought to myself, gee, you know, a lawyer could go out there, ask a question like how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, and make somebody at fault for an accident when perhaps they shouldn't be. That the possible application of the wording of a question would be, you know, could have serious practical influences. Anyhow, I don't remember if I was overly surprised, but actually this is quite a long time ago.
So how long did it take you to complete the study?
You know, this question is kind of, I have, you know, since I've done hundreds of studies involving maybe 30 to 40,000 or more individuals, to really expect a person to be able to remember exactly how long it took to study. These days, studies are being done faster because they're getting done faster and they're getting published more quickly and so on. But you know, I arrived at the University of Washington in 1973, and we published it in '74. So, or that was the publication date, and there was a much longer lag. So I'm just estimating that this was all done within a half a year. So
That's impressive. Very quick. Thank you, Chloe. Let's take some questions from the audience. Who would like to ask this question about the study you just heard about? Don't be shy. Ladies here.
How can we minimise the misinformation effect?
there are a few studies that show that if you warn people that they might be exposed to misinformation, they can put an antenna up and they can resist it a little better. But the problem is that people don't walk around with these warnings in the forefront of their consciousness. So the warning can only last for a little while, and then you go back to life, and you're not thinking about being suspicious and skeptical. So well, there is research showing that warnings can sometimes work. I mean, from a practical point of view, I don't think they're likely to still be operating to help people. Sorry, I don't have a more optimistic answer for you. But.
Thank you. There's a hand up over here. Maybe just on the other row.
If you were to redo the study in today's time, would you change anything?
To redo the study?
Yeah, today.
Well, I think what might be kind of helpful is if we had to borrow films from police departments and driver training schools, and then we had to return them in the old days. I think today, I mean, what I wish, because I've been asked for those films over the many decades, and I'd like to be able to supply materials to other scientists who want to try to replicate their work or try to extend it and learn something new in addition. I wish we had materials that I could control and could loan to people or give to people if they wanted to try to do some similar work. And with later studies, we've been able to control the materials, and so I can give them to people, but not with that particular study.
Just to follow up to that, so one, at a practical level, so if you were doing that study today, can you imagine someone walking down the street and witnessing a car accident or a staged car accident? Of course, one of the differences would be that on their mobile phone, wouldn't they, or their cell phone. Does that make people more likely to be susceptible to these sorts of misinformation effects? Do you think that divided attention would
One study that comes to mind that I think bears on that question is, it was a study that was published just a few years ago by Sparrow and Wagner, that I don't know if you've ever read about it. I read some press on it at some point. If you know you can look something up, like you can look it up on the internet, you don't remember it as well. And so if you think about that result in conjunction with your question, sort of knowing it's there might have some effect on the memory.
Yeah.
Well, I could ask a question of this group. We'll just see it. Here's how I make them talk when they're a little shy. So I talked about the stop sign, yield sign study, for example. People see an accident. I know you have you don't call them yield signs here, but will you?
Give way.
Can I call them yield? You'll think give way, or okay. And so people see an event, and later they're going to be tested. Here's the retention interval, the time between the event and the test of memory. If you want to maximize the misinformation effect, if you want to increase the probability that witnesses will tell you they saw the misinformation rather than the true sign, where do you want to introduce the misinformation? Do you want to introduce it soon after the event itself, like over here somewhere? Or do you want to introduce it closer to the test, over here somewhere? So this is the question I have for you, and I'm now going to ask you to vote. So how many people think they would want to maximize the effect, they would want to introduce the misinformation soon after the event itself? Raise your hand. Okay, I see a lot of hands. How many people would want to wait and introduce the misinformation closer to the time of the test? Raise your hand. I see a lot of hands, so we have a dispute. Now, who voted for soon after the event? Raise your hand. Okay, in that gold sweater right there, could you tell me, why did you vote for soon after the event?
Because that would change your perception of the event.
But you think it would work better to change your perception?
Yeah. Because if you have the information for a longer time, then you can remember it better. Okay,
that's a good justification. Who voted for waiting? Okay, we have in the white shirt there. Let's go with the white shirt. Why did you vote for waiting?
Well, the problem with introducing this information right after the event, the person probably still has a good memory of it at that point. So introducing this information at that point, they'll probably just be able to deny it, so no, that's wrong. So if you introduce it to after a length of time, then you're actually sort of maximising that gap for the memory to fade a little bit, and then this information has more effect. You introduce it at that stage.
Okay, and in the style of the talk show hosts. And the goal, sure, Dave, do you want to change your vote now after hearing that? Or not?
Not really, because after post-event discussion, a lot of people can just like carry on information that is told by other people.
Okay.
That can change it.
Okay, she's sticking to her story. Now, there was another person, okay, right here, we have a few more. See how this works?
I was just going to say, if you feed the information closer to the recall, surely it will then be easier to recall that misinformation because there's less time to forget it.
Closer to the test.
Yeah, closer to the
Closer
test.
to the test, okay. So we now have another kind of a justification for the vote of closer to the test. Well, we did that study. That was Loftus, Miller, and Burns. We published it in 1978. I included a long discussion of it in my eyewitness testimony book that I published a year or two later. And what we found is that the misinformation works better. I'm really proud of you for offering your opinion, even if it is wrong, because it's really good to just like speak up. But the idea, it's more effective if you delay it. And our discussion of that is a little along the lines of your discussion, which is the memory has a chance to fade, and it becomes more and more vulnerable to post-event contamination when it is in a kind of weakened stage. Yes.
It's a bit left field, but if you apply the sort of same kind of idea of misinformation through perhaps something like fake news in that way, because the misinformation and fake news comes very immediately after the news event, usually in that kind of way that they will present you with the primary definition of what they want you to think about that event. How is that different to a kind of cognitivity situation?
Well, of course, you can't compare the percentages of, yield sign to the percentages, of believing that maybe I better not say this with being filmed. Of believing something on fake news. Even with fairly immediate post-event information, you do get an effect compared to no misinformation. It's just, and so. All I can say about your example, with fake news being a more immediate presentation of fakeness, that it would probably be even more powerful if it got introduced a week or 2 weeks later, so that the original news had a chance to fade. So, it's not surprising that there is some effect. It could be even bigger. And maybe when people get really good at figuring out how to manipulate us, they'll figure out those time intervals to maximize the damage.
Fascinating. Questions? Yes. One at the front, middle, and then one toward the back. That side.
I didn't know whether you had an opinion on whether personality would influence misinformation. For example, I was one of the people that raised my hands for the incorrect answer in terms of when the misinformation was presented to a person. And I thought that if you have a personality type that is vulnerable to being influenced by others, then that might influence whether you believe whether it happened, even if it happened close to the event. So even though someone would think, knew the information, when someone else said, oh, but was it like this? Then they thought, oh, yeah, maybe it was like that. So I was wondering whether you thought personality influenced that.
Well, I do have an opinion about that because, I and other psychologists do like to look at individual differences. What kinds of differences in our cognitive ability might influence susceptibility to misinformation, or what kinds of personality factors might. And I had a chance, there's this massive study in China, going on in China. So it's with Chinese scientists, Chinese subjects, and I've had a chance to collaborate with this group of Chinese scientists. They have taken hundreds and hundreds of Chinese students and run them through all kinds of tasks, all kinds of personality variables, cognitive variables, measured their brain sizes, done neuroimaging with them, looked at their genes, just about everything, and correlated everything. So, based on that work, which we published just a few years ago, and I have a couple of links to it on my UC Irvine website to some of our papers that you can just download for free. We found that if you're a particularly cooperative person, you want to be cooperative and get along with other people, and you have somewhat low cognitive ability, that is a combination that makes you especially susceptible to memory contamination. But overall, the correlations with these individual difference variables they could be statistically significant, but they're smallish. So they're significant but small, and it means you might be slightly, more likely to fall for it if you're a cooperative person, but not strongly more likely.
Great answer. Question, yes, at the back on the right hand side.
Do you believe that your study still has some relevance in today's society? And do you believe that we're now more able to resist the pressure of misleading information? Or do you believe it's something that is part of human nature?
Well, I don't know. I think that question is similar to an earlier question about resisting misinformation. I'm not sure that we have learned all that much about how to teach people to resist it, except to raise your skeptical antenna periodically when you're processing information. But I do think that this work is valuable in other ways, that getting people to become aware of the fact that memory can be fragile, that memory is malleable, that it doesn't work like a recording device. You don't just record the event and play it back, that the process is more constructive or reconstructive, that even knowing that is going to be useful for people, particularly people who are judging legal cases where they have to decide, is this the guilty person who committed the robbery? Is this car the one that's responsible for the accident? When they have to make those judgments, and memory is a critical issue, at least they can think about and try to look at whether or not there was some misinformation, whether or not people influenced each other, whether or not there was contamination, and to be able to ask those kinds of questions.
Question out in front there. About this gentleman.
Hello. How far into so memory and belief? Do you believe that they're connected to each other? And how much is it a memory, or then it just becomes a belief and therefore somebody's truth? Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. Yeah. Well, let's take some of the more recent work where we've planted entire memories into the minds of people for things that didn't happen. We've made people, we and others, believe they were lost in a shopping mall, or they were attacked by an animal, or they nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. And when we do or they got sick eating a particular food as a child, when we do these studies and we want to know what is it they have in their mind after we supply this suggestion, we make the distinction. Do they have an actual memory? It feels like a recollection. They would describe it as a memory, and they have a lot of sensory detail that goes with it. Or is it just a belief that it happened without any feeling of recollection? I believe that's true of me, but I just can't remember when it would have happened. And sometimes you get people to go all the way to a memory. Sometimes they only go so far as to develop a belief. But we think that belief is almost the first step down that road to developing a false memory. So we would include both of those groups as if we want to know the impact of this powerful suggestion, we would include both of them, even though we might make a distinction between a belief and memory. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes it's such a mouthful for me to say, Well, when we suggested to people they were lost in a shopping mall, we got about 25% to develop a false belief or false memory. It's a mouthful to have to keep on saying false belief or false memory. Sometimes I use the shortcut of just saying it's a memory, but other people, think that distinction ought to be made every single time. So.
Do you think the misinformation effect has been reduced now because of perhaps a broader scepticism about information, where we've got so much information, so much availability of information, as you were saying earlier, through the internet? Do you think we're actually becoming more sceptical about misinformation? That might reduce the effect if you were to do the study again today.
I think if you do these experiments, well, first of all, you have to be careful with if you're using psychology students, because in psychology undergraduates have heard of, particularly by the time they get to chapter 5 of their introductory psychology course, they've learned about the misinformation effect, and they can be suspicious about what you're trying to do to them. But assuming you're not using psychology undergrads, or you disguise the study enough that the undergrads can't figure out what you're up to, we still get powerful misinformation effects when we do these experiments.
It's hard to fool people.
Well, not in a misinformation experiment. I mean, it may be out in the real world where there's all this discussion of fake news, that people have an antenna that's kind of up, and people maybe can every day begin to wonder if what I'm reading is fake news. It doesn't seem to translate into any ability to resist in a misinformation experiment. I would say that this is an effect that's pretty easy to obtain. Not quite as easy as the DRM. If for those who know that Deese wrote it, they're getting people to remember that they heard or saw a particular word on a word list that they didn't actually see or hear. That's a powerful false memory paradigm that is reliably produces false memories, but they're not quite as interesting a false memory as that your memory for the accident is different.
Is there a notable difference neurologically or emotionally in terms of cognition between memories and beliefs, so their strengths or how they appear in the brain?
Nobody's ever asked me that. They asked me a lot whether there is a difference in terms of like neural signals in the brain between a true memory and a false memory. And the little bit of work that has compared true memories to false memories shows the similarity of the neural signals. So you can't use right now brain imaging to decide whether this person is telling you something that is true versus false. But I don't think anybody has ever done the imaging that would be associated with claiming that you have a belief versus claiming you have an actual memory or recollection. But that would be an excellent doctoral dissertation for someone to do.
I think you just got your invite. Fantastic question. Chloe, yes. Do you want to ask a couple of questions that the audience sent to me?
Yes, so really interesting questions, by the way. Just to get to know a little bit more about you. So apparently you really loved maths as a child. What was it about it that you really enjoyed?
Well, I think it partly had to do with, this is kind of sad, but true, the fact that I lost my mother when I was 14 years old. She drowned in a swimming pool. And so there I was with Dad and my two brothers. And my father was a math whiz when he was in school. And he was kind of cold, as some men are. I mean, and he was. So the way we clicked is when I needed help with my math homework, he would tutor me in math, and that's how we got along really well. He enjoyed those times helping me with my math. So I got really good at math with this prize-winning mathematician as a father. I loved algebra. I loved geometry. It was so elegant. And I decided to major in mathematics while I was in college. But once I got into calculus, I really didn't like calculus. That area under the curve stuff, I don't know, it didn't turn me on. And so I took some psychology courses. I needed some electives anyhow, and just fell in love with introductory psychology and the material in the course. And so I took all the rest of my electives that I could in psychology and ended up with a double major. And that's how math came in handy though, because as a psychologist, a research psychologist, you need to know statistics. And statistics is really based on calculus. So it's a good thing I stuck it out there with the calculus, because I would then go on to teach statistics at the undergraduate and graduate level for many years. So, in the end, I did make use of that math.
Yeah. So you mentioned about how you continued to study it later on, and a female graduate in mathematical psychology is quite a rare sight at the time. So did that make you more determined?
When I started in graduate school, yes, in mathematical psychology, I was the only female amongst the faculty and the graduate students. But fortunately, another one came along a couple years later, and so I had a friend we're still friends, and she's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, I don't know. I don't know if it was just the lack of women that. I really think I just wasn't that interested in mathematical psychology, which is why I would write letters to my Uncle Joe and hem my skirts during the mathematical psychology seminars. So I didn't really get excited about what I was doing in terms of the research until kind of much later in my graduate training and then after I got my PhD.
Questions from the audience? Questions? Yes.
Actually, it's to do with your teaching. I'm just curious about the gender ratio. So obviously you've been lecturing at universities for quite a long time. Have you seen the switch over, say, or has it always been female dominated, the actual students that you've been teaching?
No. I think one way maybe we could go back and kind of measure that. These days, yes, psychology has so many female students. The undergraduates especially. You also, to some extent, see it in some graduate departments, particularly the one I'm in, because the pure perception and mathematical psychologists are in a different department. That tends to attract more males. But one way that we could see just how feminized it is when you look at the methods section of an empirical article where the person is describing of their study, and so they'll tell you about the materials they use, they'll tell you about the subject population, and these days you will see the subjects, were 200 undergraduates at the University of California, Irvine or something, 80% were female. And the word taking who comes in the door through the introductory courses to participate in these studies. And if we were to go back some years, you could probably plot, take a year's worth of articles from the Journal of Experimental Psychology or something like that, and probably see that number, was lower and lower. So it's just one clue about where the field is going.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because when you look at some areas like chemistry, as universities, across the UK and in the States, you spend a lot of time trying to recruit more women onto undergraduate courses, and certainly do that here already. But for psychology, both in the States and in the UK, it's so female dominated, and it's exactly the opposite problem. It's trying to encourage more men onto undergraduate courses, and actually it's great to see a number of males in the audience today. I would certainly encourage you to stick with psychology and study at university. Any more questions? Yes, front.
You mentioned before about like the practical implications of your work that you're doing, and I was just wondering, like in like the 70s when you were first doing the research, how easy it was to kind of have an influence on the legal system, how much they kind of listened to you then, and if there's any differences kind of then compared to today, is it easier or more difficult? How do like other professionals listen to psychologists?
Okay, so my involvement in the legal system, which is fairly unusual for a basic academic scientist, began in the 70s. I had done the Loftus and Palmer study, and I had done a few other studies on the effects of questioning witnesses. All of my studies, of course, were done with these filmed accidents or maybe a stage crime or something like that. I'd never seen any real witnesses real live witnesses. So at some point, I had a friend who was a trial lawyer with the public defender's office in Seattle, Washington, where I was teaching at the time. And so I said to him, if you would let me, I study witnesses and witness memory, and maybe there's some things that might be helpful to you, and I could consult with you for free. And what I would like is just to be able to hang around while you interview witnesses. I could see what really happens with real witnesses in real cases. So I worked on this case. It was a woman. She was accused of murdering her boyfriend. There were memory and eyewitness issues in the case. And I helped with the case. I got to see real witnesses close up. And this woman was found not guilty. So I wrote an article for a magazine called Psychology Today, which was a very popular magazine for not only people interested in psychology, but also many members of the legal profession read this magazine. It had a circulation of about 1 million at the time. And I wrote about that court case, and I wrote about smash versus hit, and B versus A, and some of the other findings. And after that article was published, lawyers started to ask me, would you help me with my case? Would you lecture to my group of lawyers about what psychology knows about eyewitness testimony? And it was really through that article and through publicizing the scientific work in a way that reached a large public audience that I was able to have the opportunities to be involved in legal cases. Now, when mostly defense attorneys in criminal cases would ask me to testify on behalf of somebody who was accused, sometimes the judges would allow the testimony and sometimes they wouldn't. When a judge said to the defendant, I'm not going to let you have this expert, we don't need an expert in this case, they would usually give one of two reasons. They would say, this is all common sense, everybody knows all this stuff the psychologists would talk about, we don't need an expert, it'll be time consuming and a waste of time. Or they might say, this expert is invading the province of the jury. It's up to the jury to decide whether the eyewitness was in a position to see and hear what's being claimed. We don't need an expert to step into that role. Well, defendant is convicted, sent off to prison, because eyewitness testimony is very powerful, and many defendants would then appeal to a higher court. They would appeal their convictions, and they would say that they didn't get a fair trial because the psychologist couldn't testify. So what did the higher courts do? In the 70s, the higher courts were saying, it's up to the judge. The judge has the discretion whether to let the psychologist in or not. We're not going to overturn this conviction. We're not going to find an abuse of discretion. And the conviction stood. Then, in 1983, something different happened. A higher court, it was the state Supreme Court of the state of Arizona, reversed a conviction in a murder case because the trial judge had excluded my testimony. That Arizona Supreme Court said this defendant had a right to that testimony and granted a new trial. That was 1983. That was the state of Arizona. A year later, California followed Arizona. The California Supreme Court reversed a conviction when the different expert was excluded from testifying. A year after that, an appellate court in Alaska. And then now we've seen this string of reversals for excluding expert testimony. And it has become much easier for psychologists and psychological testimony to be introduced into these cases.
So just a few more questions about your work and its impact on the criminal justice system. So because of the unreliability of memory, do you believe that eyewitness testimony shouldn't be used as evidence?
No, I don't believe that, because some eyewitness testimony is accurate and reliable, and some cases could never ever be prosecuted because all there is eyewitness testimony. So I don't see us moving to a system where, as some have suggested, if there's a single eyewitness and nothing else, maybe it's not enough to go forward with a prosecution, but I don't think that's going to end up being the solution.
Mm.
And if I look out my window and I see my neighbor who I've known for years, take my Los Angeles Times and take it, from my driveway, I'd like to be able to tell somebody about it. And you wouldn't, even with very good eyewitness testimony, where you recognize it's somebody you know well, and you can see clearly, and it's daylight and everything, you would have problems.
Mm.
It's fine. So one of the things that I guess I would consider about your career in terms of your legal cases is the confidence of being able to stand up and present your professional, your expert views in a legal setting. I mean, how do you prepare for those sorts of cases?
Well, I think from experience it helps. When I started, I was incredibly nervous. I was probably 30 years old when I testified for the first time. So I had only been out of school with my PhD about 5 years. And when I started teaching, I used to write out every word, including the jokes, because I was so afraid that I might freeze and forget where I was. So I needed it as a crutch. And then, as years go by, you keep on teaching, and pretty soon you don't need those crutches. I have now testified in around 300 trials, and I've had all kinds of hostile cross-examination. I know what to expect because particularly these prosecutors, they share their transcripts. Sometimes I hear the same old, questions time and time again. Some questions have to do with, aren't you just a defense hoe? You're doing this, to protect pedophiles and get a bunch of money. Or they might try to point out unpopular, famous people whose cases I've worked on. Michael Jackson, or Bill Cosby, or O.J. Simpson, or the Oklahoma bomber. And while I'm here in Britain, I open up the paper this morning at breakfast and I see there's going to be a review of the Lockerbie bomber case. It's in the news in the paper today. I worked on that case and wrote a whole paper on the memories of the shopkeeper in the Lockerbie bomber case. And I ended my article saying, I don't think we know where the Lockerbie bomber is. So look for that review. It's a very interesting thing that they're going to do this even though he has died.
sort of so many stories there to follow that one. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, gentlemen, midway back.
I just wanted to ask, are you still publishing any research? And if so, what is it?
I am publishing articles with my collaborators and students, and generally what the articles that I publish are descriptions of the most recent empirical studies. So we have published, for example, recently a couple of papers on what we call memory blindness. And for some of the recent papers, I have links on my UC Irvine website, so you can download the papers for free. But in memory blindness, what we've done is we've asked people to report on their memory for a crime that they saw, and then we feed them back. We tell them they gave answers that were different from what they gave. So they said the thief had a green jacket, and we suggest to them later that they told us the jacket was brown. And then we might ask them a question. And we're looking at whether people even detect that they've just been fed back an answer that's different from the one they gave. And to our surprise, many people do not detect that we've given them an answer that's different from the one they gave. And when they don't detect it, they'll often shift themselves, their memory, in the direction of this new kind of misinformation. So memory blindness. And we think this is particularly relevant in police interrogation settings where sometimes it's the police officer who will write out the report of what the witness told him, and then say, here's what you told me, could you just take a look at this and then sign it? Well, what if there are errors in it? Is the witness even gonna notice? Of course, sometimes they do, but many times they don't. And another kind of situation where I think, I don't know if you've had this experience, Lori, but, or do I have to call you Professor Butler? No. Oh, okay. Sometimes when you do an interview for a magazine, someone will call you back and do fact checking.
Yeah.
And they will call you back, and so I'm just checking over, here's what you told our journalist. Well, we might not catch all those fact check things when they're fed back to us, and we just might say, okay, that sounds okay, I'll go with that, I guess I said that, and that can even become your memory of what you said. So I think there's some other situations where this memory blindness is relevant.
The memory blindness is fascinating because there's power imbalance as well, isn't there, between the person that's, the experimenter or the police officer and then the subject or the witness or the person that's giving the evidence. And that presumably plays quite an important role in that dynamic as well.
We do know that people are responsive to the source of the misinformation, that they are more likely to accept misinformation and be influenced by it if it's an authority figure or someone they think is knowledgeable or has some special information. They're more likely to buy it. So, yeah, I think that plays a role.
So, two questions at the front. Yes, Peter?
Hello, I'm a faculty member here, and you have contributed to the science and the society for all these decades, and you are still excited about what's going on. So my question is, how do you keep this motivation, and what motivates you? And do you have any suggestion for younger scientists?
Well, I think part of what motivates me, I wouldn't wish on other people. Which is, I have been in the middle of some wars. Something, for example, called the memory wars, where this is what really started coming about in the 1990s or so, when people were going into therapy. They were going in with one kind of problem. They were depressed, or they were anxious, they had an eating disorder, and they were coming out of this therapy believing that they had horrible childhood sexual abuse happen to them, sometimes forced into satanic rituals and being forced to watch animals be sacrificed and so on. When I began to speak out about these questionable memories, I developed a lot of enemies. And these enemies can be really vicious. So they have, tried to drum up letter writing campaigns to get me fired from my job. They have called in threats on my life to universities where I've been invited to speak. They force these universities to supply armed policemen to guard me during these lectures. This all went on at the height of the memory wars. At the same time, and what would help to deal with all this is these very, very grateful family members who would send me letters saying, thank goodness you're speaking out for all of us, and we need you, and to show this appreciation. So I save all those letters. I have something called a When Blue file. I have an electronic one if they come in an email, and I have a snail mail one if they can come in regular mail. And so I can reread these articles of gratitude and remind myself when I'm in the midst of dealing with one of these enemies, why I keep doing what I'm doing.
Really want to start at credible resilience. Yes, one more question. Yeah.
So you've mentioned obviously the memory blindness is something you're working on right now. But is there anything outside of memory or anything that you're intrigued by but you haven't had a chance to actually look into, or you would like to look into in the future? Is there anything that really grabs you that you just...
Well, one thing that kind of grabbed me that I would love to look into, but I need somebody with really, really good Photoshop skills, is I read a couple of papers by a Stanford computer guy named Valenson, and he would do something like, I need a prop. Let's say this is a can of Coca-Cola. And so if I take a picture of you endorsing this can of Coca-Cola or looking at it lovingly and show it to you, you like it more. And I thought, wow, think of what Facebook could do with this. They could take your picture and Photoshop the Coke can or any certain kind of lemonade or any kind of food or any kind of detergent and feed you back on your Facebook page, you lovingly looking at this product, and you're going to like it more and maybe want to buy it. And I thought, that is fascinating. I wonder if it could also affect your memory, if it could make you think that you'd actually interacted with that product in the past. And so I think there's a study there. But you need certain kind of skills to be able to create the materials for doing that study, which I don't personally have.
Okay. So you actually have them there as well.
Do you feel that can actually be used as a positive thing? Say, for example, with obesity and all of that stuff now is maybe recreating or that kind of thing used with food. And positive.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you just showed somebody just massively enjoying a stick of celery, I mean, maybe we would get people eating a healthier diet. But that's just an empirical question.
Chloe, last question.
Yeah, so just before we come to an end, do you have any words of advice for anyone in the audience who's thinking of having a career as a psychologist?
Well, I just think, first of all, I think being a psychology professor is an absolutely great career. Not all of our students end up, of course, going to teach in a college somewhere. Many of them, I have a few students right now because of the work we do who are having interviews with Facebook and Google and are going to go into, and work on the fake news problem. There's all kinds of great careers, I think, for doing research in all kinds of settings. And I I love experimental psychology because it teaches, and I mean that broadly, not just, I mean, that includes all kinds of research psychology, because it really teaches you how to ask the right questions about any kind of message that somebody's trying to fob off on you, and then it teaches you, we have to ask, well, what is the evidence for what you're saying? What exactly is the evidence? And so for us, that means, was there a study? Was it a good study? Did it have a control group? What kind of statistics were done? Was it proper statistics? And we get all those skills in our training. So I'd say go for learning more psychology.
Absolutely agree. Elizabeth, thank you so much. It's been an enormous privilege. On behalf of everyone, I think, the word I've heard over the last sort of 24 hours or so repeatedly is inspiration, and you certainly have inspired us today, so thank you so much.
Thank you.